Almost a year ago, at the first PDN of 2007, Martha and I came and we presented our book, How to Survive the Crisis and Profit in the Process. At the time, the Dow was on its way to hitting 14,000. There was, except from a very, very small group of observers, we were headed towards a continuation of a spectacular run of a bull market, historic bull market. Even a bear such as Stephen Roach at Morgan Stanley had thrown in the towel in January. I turned to Martha and said, "Oh, he can't even take it. I mean, his friends have too many private planes." And he said, "I guess we're just, I don't know how this is going to resolve itself." Stephen had been warning for years about a resolution which he called the end game. 3 days before we delivered the paper, on February 26th, the Dow dropped over 500 points, recovering back to lose 419, the largest drop in a very long period of time. The night before it dropped, I had read a paper by somebody I had run across years before who had called the top of the Japanese market in 1990, Martin Armstrong. And in his paper, I had never understood how he had done it, but he had been sort of famous for having done so. He then disappeared off the map in 1999 when he was arrested by the U.S. federal authorities and held in prison for 7 years on contempt charges. And on that night, before the market dropped, I had run across his paper, published in 1999, where he showed his methodology. And it was just the strangest methodology, I mean, that anybody ever come up with. It's sort of like a ruler and a marker over a couple centuries, and wow, and seeing that it correlated and going forward, and he hit that date on 1999, December 31st, and blew everybody away. The Japanese Nikkei dropped from, 38,000 down to 8,300. Took 13 years to do. He called it to the day. On that night, I read his paper, and he called a drop for the very next day. I was shocked. And the next day it happened. And 3 days later, we presented our paper before the PDN. The reception of the paper was sort of shocked, too. I mean, I got up and said, we're going to have a depression. It's going to hell in a handbasket and, open up that lid of the toilet. And people, I'm sure, didn't know what to do about it. I began writing papers. And in May, I posted a paper on the internet called Subprime America Infects Asia and Europe, and said by the summer, what we had done in the subprime market was going to affect credit markets and affect this country. In July, $2 billion hedge funds of Bear Stearns collapsed. Absolutely collapsed. In August, the contraction started in earnest, shocking people. They hoped that September the markets would recover. They held a little. By October, they started falling again. This January, $6 trillion of value was lost in the world markets. It is accelerating. I'm not here to predict what's going to happen today. I did that last week in Dallas. Gave an hour-and-a-half talk on my sense of where we're headed, because things are a lot clearer now than they were last year. Last year was purely conceptual. Now it's actual. I had no idea what a constant proportion debt obligation was. I don't think very many other people do too. But it's going to affect all of us. But I want to just come up with a little quote here from somebody who very few people know about. His name is Barton Biggs. And Barton, he looks like his name. I mean, he looks like his name. Barton Biggs. All right? For 30 years, he was with Morgan Stanley, ran their research division. When Barton left Morgan Stanley in 2003 to form his own hedge fund, he was chief investment strategist at that major Wall Street firm, the smart boy of the smart boys. He left his firm to form his hedge fund, Trax Partners. And in 2003, Barton said, The stock market is going to come up by 50%. They had dropped significantly after the 2000 collapse, and they pretty much did. In 2008, last month, Barton published a book, Wealth, War, and Wisdom, just published a couple of months ago. And this is Barton's, some of the things he said. The rich get complacent, assuming they will have time to, quote, extricate themselves and their wealth when trouble comes. He then goes on to say the rich are mistaken. Events move much faster than anyone expects. And the barbarians are on top of you before you can escape. And in the last pages of his book, this is what Barton says. This is advice. Insure yourself against these by buying a remote farm or ranch and stock it with seed, fertilizer, canned food, wine, medicine, clothes. Now, I want to tell you something about, I just saw a picture of Barton. I think he's like me. He's never planted a thing in his life. I think Barton out there on his farm is going to be as much trouble as I'm going to be on somebody else's farm. And then he adds at the end, to give his point a little more emphasis, a few rounds over the approaching brigands' heads would probably be a compelling persuader that they're easier farms to pillage. This is Barton Biggs. This is a guy. All right? And so what I want to say is things are changing very, very rapidly. The fissures have started to appear, and I think they are going to increase in scope and in magnitude. And I want to speak today why this is so. And before I do, I'd like to speak of relate to three other predictions about these times. The first one is Marshall's dear, dear friend and mentor, Buckminster Fuller. Because of Marshall, finally last fall, he got me to actually read the introduction to Bucky's book, The Critical Path. And in the introduction to that book, which he wrote right before he passed away in 1983, I think, he said in his introduction, mankind is on the verge of an unprecedented crisis. I had a discussion with Marshall last week. I said, Marshall, you knew Bucky. Bucky chose his words very carefully. Very, very carefully. And he chose his words not based on the effect that they would have. Bucky chose his words based on the truth that they carried to him. And I reminded Marshall, we were having a discussion about the subject we're talking about today, that he used the words unprecedented. I said, Marshall, human history has been through wars, famines, plagues. We've survived despotism. I don't know if we're going to survive democracy, but we have been through a lot. And Bucky used the words unprecedented. He then went on to say, in fact, he titled his introduction to his book, The Critical Path, the last book he published, I believe. And he called it The Collapse of the World's Power Structures.